Reminders is a family-owned videography business offering cinematic travel videos and product advertisements. You can view our content at Rominders.com. That is ROAMINDERS.com.
I'm on! Roll!
Thank you for tuning in today. Today we're joined by a really, I think, impressive guest, but I guess that remains to be seen from your end. But we're going to be talking with Dr. William Ramsey. Bill Ramsey might be best classified as a true freak of nature. He's a professor of philosophy who spent the first 18 years of his career teaching in the illustrious philosophy department at Notre Dame University. Since 2007, Dr. Ramsey has been at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, turning out papers on research that includes eliminative materialism, representationalism, bigotry and religious belief, and intuition as evidence. In addition to making significant contributions to the world of philosophy, cognitive science, and implications on artificial intelligence, as well as winning numerous awards for excellence in teaching, Bill Ramsey is noted as one of the hardest working climbers on the planet, with hundreds of 513s under his belt and nearly 30 514s, most sent over the age of 40. One of Ramsey's most recent feats was a 514A jumbo pumping height at the age of 59. When I first read Bill's 2012 article, Making the Grade, Why You May Be Wrong About What's Right About Chipping, originally published in Rock and Ice, I knew we needed to invite him on the show. Today he joins us, so without further ado, it's a great honor to welcome Bill Ramsey. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. This is really fun.
Before we get too deep into it, I guess I have one particular question. There's a lot of information about you floating around online, but nothing is organized. I mean, a lot of time you'll see climbers with just a list of all their sends, and you'll see philosophers with a list of all their publications. We couldn't find a CV on you except for one that says teaches philosophy. Is there a reason why you're not so bombastic about your accomplishments?
Laziness for the most part. I'm actually really quite embarrassed that I don't have a website. Most faculty members have a website, and I've started to do that a number of times, and then something happens and I get distracted, but it is coming. I am going to put together a website. It'll be mostly about philosophy and my teaching, but I'll probably have a link to something having to do with climbing probably. But, everybody asked me, well, why don't you have an 8A NU account? And I thought, well, that would mean I'd have to sort of figure out all these climbs that I've done and put those in the database. And that sounds like an awful lot of work. And also I'd have to try to remember all of them, and that would take a lot of energy on my part. So the main reason, quite frankly, is laziness on my part. And unlike, I think, most people, of course, who are professional climbers, their career depends upon having a database like that. But I'm a weekend warrior. I'm a recreational climber. It's not my job. So for that reason, it's just, I've done some climbs, and these are some of the ones I've done, but I don't really see the need to kind of have a document that stores all that information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it also adds to kind of this mysterious, legendary status that you've sort of gained throughout the years. I was hoping we could bounce off of that into more of a philosophical explanation of something that you seem to publish on or talk on pretty regularly. And I'm wondering if you could kind of, I don't want to say water it down, but a lot of our listeners aren't necessarily philosophers. A lot of them are climbers and outdoor enthusiasts. And I was wondering if you could maybe put a description of our question in terms that would appeal to all of us. So let me send this question to you, and we can talk about it a little bit. So could you briefly explain representationalism, and maybe, if possible, using a route or a rock face as an example? And then if you could push that more on your beliefs about it, of whether or not you think representationalism is an accurate account of what's going on when we experience a rock or a rock face.
Yeah, sure. So let me just step back a little bit. So the area of philosophy that I work on is actually sort of a combination of both philosophy and cognitive science. And I was attracted to UC San Diego. That's where I got my doctorate, precisely because they had a cross-disciplinary program in cognitive science. It was one of the first main ones in the country. And so I like that. I like doing philosophy that's linked to science. And I was always been fascinated about questions about the mind and how the mind works and that sort of thing. So that's what attracted me to that program. So one of the big issues in cognitive science, where philosophy has weighed in and been beneficial, has to do with this question of, if you think about it, well, what I just said, think about it, right? So you're contemplating a climb you're going to get on this weekend. Maybe you have a project. So we're going to assume that your mind is your brain. And you're thinking about the moves on the climb. You're thinking about the rock, where you're going to rest, how long you're going to rest. How is it that these neurons in your brain come to have the capacity to think about something? It's this aboutness, right? How does that work? How does your brain represent the climb that you're going to get on? That's a huge, huge, huge question in neuroscience, in cognitive psychology, in cognitive anthropology, and all these different areas. It's one thing that fundamentally the brain seems to do, which is represent reality, different aspects of reality. This morning you got it. You thought, okay, I'm going to have this podcast with Bill later. How's that work in the brain? How do you depict reality? How do you represent reality? How do you represent something like a rock climb? And so that's been an area where I've tried to weigh in. And in a sense, cognitive scientists have said, well, philosophers, they've been thinking about this thing called representation, how one thing can stand for something else. They've been thinking about that for a couple thousand years. So let's turn to the philosophers for some insight on this. And so that's why it's an area where philosophy and cognitive science intersect. And that's an area where I've done a good chunk of my work. In 2007, I published a book with Cambridge Press on representation and how representation occurs in the brain. And basically what I'm suggesting is there's all these different ways in which neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, people working in artificial intelligence are trying to make sense of how the brain represents reality, how the brain represents different things and events and people and so on. And I'm arguing, well, some of these accounts seem viable. They seem like, yeah, this is actually a pretty good way to make sense of what's actually happening in the brain, how this happens. Then I want to say, but these other ones over here that are maybe even more popular, they don't actually work. There's all sorts of deep philosophical problems, and they actually aren't going to be the proper pathway of research for making sense of how neurons come to represent reality. And so that's where I've done a great deal of my work. And as I said, it's been a very important area in cognitive science. It's been this sort of big mystery with regard to the brain. One big mystery is how can it be conscious? Another big mystery is how does it represent reality? And it's actually an area where I think we've made some significant progress, and that's what makes it so exciting. So that's how representationalism works. I don't think anybody denies, or actually I should take that back. There are people who reject the idea that the brain represents, or that we should try to use representation as an explanatory posit in making sense of how the brain processes information. But the overwhelming majority of people in artificial intelligence and neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience and so on, they do think that the brain, one of the most fundamental things that neurons do is represent and depict reality in different ways. And so what we want to try to do is understand how that can possibly happen. And let me just sort of touch on one little mystery about that. Usually when we think of representations, we think of things out there in the world, like I'll look at the thermometer and it represents or it depicts the temperature. Or I'll look at a word and the word DOG represents these fun little furry animals that run around. And in all these cases, for something to actually function as a representation, that requires an independent interpreting mind, right? That requires us to come and interpret the word dog to mean furry little animals. That means we have to interpret the position of the mercury on the thermometer. Actually, I don't know if anybody still uses thermometers with mercury, but assuming they do, that requires some mind to interpret the position of the mercury in that particular way. Okay, well, it seems then that a key aspect of how representation works is an interpreting mind. But now, if we want to say that representation occurs inside of a mind as an internal component of a mind, well, how the hell is that going to work, right? Does that mean that there's a little mind inside of your mind? And then if that little mind has to have its representations, then is there a little mind inside of that little mind inside of that little mind? And you have this infinite regress. So the big project is to try to understand how representation can happen, how it can take place in the brain without there being an interpreting mind, that's interpreting these neurons as standing for something else or depicting something else or representing something else. And so that's been a huge, huge, huge challenge, but it's actually a challenge where I think we've made some headway. And so I actually, again, think it's an exciting area where there's actually, you can see some progress being made.
Which for philosophy, that's a big step forward. It's not something that moves these great steps every day. So that's promising.
Yeah, I think part of what helps philosophy is working with the scientists, because what we discover, and let me just back up and say, I'm considered somebody who's very much a naturalistic philosopher. I mean, there are some philosophers who sort of think there are these a priori truths that are out there in Plato's heaven, and we have unique insight into these truths, and we can do basically everything from the armchair. And there may be some areas of philosophy where that makes sense, but I'm more inclined to think that philosophy is here to work hand in hand with the sciences. And that scientists come up with new discoveries. We discover things about nature that are really counterintuitive that we never would have expected. And that helps prod philosophical thinking. But at the same time, as the sciences proceed, they also are invoking different sorts of philosophical concepts like representation or consciousness or rationality. And so philosophers have something to contribute to that project as well, because we can help them with these more abstract theoretical concepts that are being utilized in the sciences.
I have a question that it does not necessarily relate to what you just explained, but I can attach it to it. There's so many stories about you online, and I think one of our favorite ones is a teenage you at Smith Rock jumping on a 512 and then seeing a rap line of no other than Tony De Niro and John Collins. So let's test your representationalism in your mind, your brain, by depicting different life events. Can you break down what happened? What was it like?
Well, so I started climbing at Smith Rock in the mid 1970s. My dad was a climber, and I grew up in this little tiny town, Madras, close to Smith Rock. And my best friend in high school, Alan Watts, was also really getting into rock climbing. So we started climbing together quite a bit. And at that time, Smith Rock was just this little back, woods, like basically no one had ever heard of it. Very few people ever came there from outside of Oregon to climb. And so we, of course, had this enormous inferiority complex with regard to Yosemite and California, and that's where all the superstars were and whatnot. But we would go down there, we do these pilgrimages, and we go down there and we would sort of like to test things. And this one trip, this was I think in 79, I did the Northwest Face of Half Dome with a friend, and that was its own kind of little epic, but it turned out okay. And I had seen on the cover of Mountain Magazine this picture of Ray Jardine on Separate Reality. And I thought, man, that is so awesome. And, it looks like it's basically just a hand crack, and I'm pretty good at hand jamming. We should go check that out. And everybody's like, what? No, that's 512, dude. That's way beyond anything you should be getting on. But I was pretty cocky, and so I talked my friends into just going there. And I thought, I'm not going to climb it. I'm just going to check it out, basically. And so I got on it, and I actually found it wasn't a hand crack. It was definitely finger jamming, but the finger jams actually weren't too bad, and I could get toe jams in, and I got on, and I placed all the gear on lead, and I fell off a few times and kind of checked it out. I was actually hang dogging at that time. The Oregonians were known for cheating in that way. And anyhow, so I lowered down. I thought, well, maybe I'll try this, for real. And as I'm waiting, this rope appears, and all of a sudden, because you have to rappel into it, and all of a sudden, this god of climbing at the time, this superstar, Tony De Niro, appears. And then another really well-known climber who had just put up Genesis, I forget his name now, Erickson, I think, he appears, and they were going to check it out. And then Bill Price pokes his head over the lip, and he's there. And it just seemed like, oh my God, I'm here with all the superstars in California, and I'm just this piddling, nobody from Oregon. I was super self-conscious and suddenly very embarrassed. And I said, hey, look, guys, I'm sorry, my gear's in here. I probably shouldn't be here. I'll tell you what, I'll just go up and I'll try it. And as soon as I fall off, I'll clean everything and get out of your way, and you can have at it. And, it was actually really cool about it. He's like, oh, don't worry about it. It's all fine. So I went up, but I just did it. I'm sure I was super self-conscious about trying to look as smooth as possible. And everything just kind of fell into place. And so Bill Price was on top, and he came over and shook my hand. He said, wow, that's really awesome. And they didn't know my name, but they knew I was just this kid from Oregon, this teenager from Oregon. So the funny story is that then later, when Alan got such a reputation for being such a top-level climber, when people had told this story about this teenager from Oregon climbing Separate Reality, they automatically just assumed it was Alan. So he would keep bumping into people and like, Alan, I heard you did this separate reality. And he's like, well, actually, no, it's this other guy. So it's actually a pretty funny story. But yeah, that was one of those days where I think this is very rare, but it's one of those times in life when everything clicks and everything falls into place and you just sort of rise to the occasion and have this really remarkable, surreal kind of athletic experience. And it was really, really fun. So it was very, very memorable indeed. Yes, that is definitely a mental representation that I enjoy going back to.
Okay, so I have a question. After that event, were you more cocky or a little bit more humble?
Probably more cocky, I'd have to say. Because I remember going back to Alan and saying, Alan, we're not so far behind. I mean, I know we have this inferiority complex up here in Oregon, but you know what? We're not so bad. And I don't know if that incentivized him in any way, but I think he realized that, well, gee, if Bill's going down to Yosemite and doing 512s, then I can start doing that as well. And that's exactly what he did. And then he started he started doing first ascents in Yosemite that at the time were the hardest things that were being done. And so it was just one of those stepping stones that I suspect, I got I got a pretty good confidence boost out of that. And so, yeah, but it was really neat. It was really fun.
I don't know. Gaia and I were talking about that just before talking to you, and we were trying to come up with some kind of analogy. And we were thinking maybe it'd be like an actor who's just thinking they're all alone on a stage, and all of a sudden in the audience is, their favorite idols or something like that.
Yeah. I think usually in that situation, I tend to choke. Probably that'd be the more normal thing. But just every now and then things go the other way, and it's really nice when they do.
So I was wondering if we could jump ahead 40 years after that, and talk a little bit about the 514A jumbo pumping hate that you sent. I think it was at the age of 59, and if I'm not wrong about this, a week later you had a hip surgery, and I was wondering if you could take us through the process of getting through all of that.
Yeah. So, when I was in San Diego, I met Randy Levitt, and Randy was also a very top level climber, and he's a super good guy, and I knew that he had been he's just a remarkable area developer. He's done so much development. He's put up so many FAs. And I knew that he had done this climb at Clark Mountain, which is just across the border in California, just about 40 minutes outside of Las Vegas. And it's just a stunningly beautiful line. It's just this overhanging line. It just goes straight up. And of course, it's right next to Jumbo Love, which is probably right now the hardest climb in, at least in America, and maybe even North America. And it's just this unbelievable wall. So I knew that some friends were going up there, and I'd always wanted to do that route. I'd always thought it was a stunning line. And so I started going up there with my friends and started working on it, and found that it seemed doable, but there was a very, very hard move on it. And I got pretty close one season, didn't quite do it. Went back another season, didn't quite do it. And this was kind of going to be my last season. And also it's a kind of brutal hike. It's you got to go through different tiers, and it's about an hour, maybe 2,000 foot elevation gain, 3,000 foot or something like that. So it's a tough place, and I had been really having trouble with my hip, and it was really starting to bother me, and I'd had it diagnosed as osteoarthritis, and it needed some kind of a surgery, some kind of replacement or something. But anyhow, I was getting pretty damn close on this thing, and I was also, but not close enough. And I kind of had given up on the thought that I was going to do it. And I went up there one day, and it was getting pretty late in the summer. It was in June. And I just sort of thought, well, I'm just going to try my hardest. And I want to feel good about my effort. I don't think there's any way I'm going to do it. But it's not a bad day. There seems to be a bit of a breeze. It's a little cooler than it normally had been. And I can't remember if it's my first or second try on it, but I made the move. I stuck the move. And then I found myself at the rest there's two cruxes. There's the first crux, which I find to be the hardest. It's a big dyno. And then the second crux is still pretty demanding. And there's a bad rest in between. But one way you can make the rest feel a little better is you can get a really tight, high heel hook, where it's an inside heel hook. But of course, it's from the heel hook. Naturally, it was the leg that had the hip problem, and that particular position was just excruciating on the hip. And I thought, so I'm there, and I'm thinking to myself, well, you're going to get surgery anyhow. Now, so
that's so great.
You want to do this climb or don't you? Yeah, I know it's going to freaking hurt, but do you want to rest or don't you? You know, it's one of these situations where you got to decide if you're willing to put up with the pain to get what you want in life. And I just decided to gut it out. And, you know, I'm going to use this yoke. I'm going to stay here for quite a while and really try to give this second crux as good a go as possible. And I did. And the second crux felt pretty good. And the next thing I knew, I was going to the anchors. So it was just one of those, again, special days when things happen to fall into place. And, you know, you just, if you put in enough effort, and it's one of those days where I was just mostly concentrating on trying hard, things sometimes fall into place. And so that was actually a really, really neat experience. And then I did that. I went ahead and had surgery like 6 days, 7 days, 8 days later. So yeah, that was actually a really, really neat experience. And again, it's just an incredibly beautiful climb.
So I don't know. There's so many questions that come in as you're talking. I want to talk about your recovery process, but before doing that, I'm not a 514 climber, and I'm wondering if you could tell me from your point of view, when you look at jumbo pumping hate and compare it to jumbo love, just how much harder is jumbo love?
It's hard for me to say because I probably can't comprehend it. I probably can't appreciate it. You know, I belayed Jonathan Siegrist on it when he did it, and seeing some of the moves that he would do and some of the like giant dynos to mono pockets and things like that, I actually probably have a hard time even fathoming. You know, even though I've done 514, it's as far beyond as anything is, and I don't really fully understand it. Other than just to say, you know, it's more of what I'm doing or what a 512 climber is doing. It's just more of that, but at a higher level, where the holds are smaller, the dynos are bigger, the feet are smaller, everything's just a little bit worse. And that is kind of how it is for everybody, basically, in climbing. Is, you know, for me, the process of trying to work up through the grades and the process of trying to perform at a higher level, I really enjoy that sort of process. This may be not for everybody. I think a lot of people can just go out and have fun. I think that's great. But I like the process of trying to get stronger and trying to get better and trying to challenge myself in that way. And I think for other people who are doing things like jumbo love, it's the exact, I know that's how it is for Jonathan. He just likes to challenge himself in that way. And so in some ways, it's not that different. In some ways, when the very top climbers are climbing at the very, very top level, they're basically doing the same thing that somebody who's trying to break into 511 is trying to do, or 512 is trying to do. They're pushing themselves, they're trying hard, they're maybe projecting where they have to deal psychologically with a large number of failures. At the end of the day, they're really not that different. And it's just that they're just doing it at a much, much higher level. And they're maybe training a lot more, and they're a lot more committed or devoted. So it's a matter maybe of degree, but I don't think it's necessarily a matter of difference in terms of altogether different sort of activity. I think it's the same activity. It's just going on at a higher level.
That's actually a great description and explanation. I was wondering if maybe you could tell us how you're feeling, like after the surgeries. Are you getting back on?
So the first surgery, they tried to avoid a hip replacement, which is often a good idea if you can do it when you're younger, by shaving off a great deal. There's a lot of bone buildup that happens on the femur, and they shaved that off, and the problem is it just didn't work because the labrum inside the joint was just in such bad shape. So they, same surgeon, marvelous surgeon, Eric Kubiak, he did a full hip replacement in June, and I just have to say, unbelievable. I was walking in 4 weeks with less pain than I've been walking in 3 years. Everybody said I had a noticeable limp. It just seemed like in no time at all, I was recovered. And it's so amazing when you think about, as we were saying earlier, what you do, they cut the femur off, they cut the head off, and they hammer in a new ball, and they replace the socket, and they put your leg back together. You think, wow, that is really extreme. But gee, in terms of how I'm feeling, in terms of the hip, I feel fabulous. It's just, a few months later, and I'm like back to feeling better than before, basically as good as new. So I actually feel great about that. And but of course, with the surgery and the virus, I've gotten out of shape, and so I'm working on trying to get back into shape. I'm 60 now, which is a little harder to do when you're 60. I find that it takes longer to get results from the training. But I'm trying to stick with that, and actually looking forward to having a hopefully pretty decent climbing season in the fall.
A couple of months ago, we had the opportunity to talk to philosopher Emily Thomas, and we had a fantastic conversation about the sublime. So we were wondering, how do you, Bill Ramsey, understand the sublime? And do you think it's a primary draw of rock climbing, or could it be?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say that I'm one of those kinds of philosophers who's very a nuts and bolts kind of person. I'm very much trying to be grounded in reality and hard science and all that kind of stuff. And of course, other philosophers deal with the more abstract issues like the sublime. So oftentimes when people bring up the sublime, I kind of scratch my head and I'm not 100% sure what they're referring to. I want to know exactly what are you talking about? Of course, if you could answer that question, it wouldn't be sublime, right? So that's what's tricky. But I actually do think the sublime does exist. And think I do experience occasionally in climbing. And I think that there are these moments that I think are very sublime that I was just talking about with Jumbo Pumping Hate or Separate Reality, where it seems that we transcend our normal mediocrity, at least for people like me. And you can enter a realm of performance that is surprisingly at a high quality. And they're rare and they're fleeting. But it does happen every now and then, and that's what makes climbing so beautiful. It makes it so attractive so much of the time. I think everybody who's climbed for any period of time has had those kinds of moments, those kinds of experiences. And, you come down and you're just like, wow, that was really special. That was really significant. I am going to remember this for a very, very long time. So I can't define it and I can't describe it, but I do think I've experienced it a few times.
So I've noticed there's kind of like this, I wouldn't call it a renegade attitude, but there's a bit of a renegade that comes out in some of your writings towards practical ethics and even some of the actions of what happened in climbing at Smith Rock. I think renegade in a very positive way that it leads to some change. So I'm just going to read a little description and then ask you to put on more of a practical ethics type hat, just to see if you have anything else going on with this, what I think is a bit of a positive renegade disposition. So in February of 2012, you wrote this article, Making the Grade, featured in Rock and Ice. In this piece, you make the argument that manufacturing holds is sometimes acceptable. And you were also intertwined early with the pioneers of modern sport climbing who pushed us away from this exclusive bottom-up approach. So I'm wondering if you see any current dogmatic attitudes that are slowing the progression of rock climbing.
Well, that's an interesting question. First off, let me sort of say a little bit about that essay. By the time I wrote that, I'd done quite a few 514s and higher level limestone routes. And if you're being realistic, you realize that a lot of these routes took a lot of work to create. And there's holds that are created. There's just no getting around it. And most professional climbers, top level climbers knew that, but they couldn't say anything about it because they were sponsored and they had to be very careful about what they would say. And so there was this kind of ethic at the time that no, all chipping is bad, all chipping is evil. Well, I didn't have that problem. I had the freedom to be a philosopher. I already had my paycheck coming from the university. And also, philosophers have always had the role of a kind of social critic. And to some degree, I think so many people today who have an existence through social media, they're so concerned about being popular and getting likes and things like that. Whereas for philosophers, we're kind of supposed to piss people off, right? I mean, we're sort of supposed to be unpopular. And I always feel like if we're doing our job properly, there's going to be a lot of people who hate us, basically. And so I don't mind that kind of status at all. I don't think it's problematic. And so that's what I was trying to express in that essay. I was just trying to say, let's be realistic. Let's be honest about what's really going on here at these upper level grades. And I think a lot of professional climbers agreed with me, but they couldn't come right out and say that.
So great.
So your question, though, is about what's happening in contemporary rock climbing that may need to be challenged in various ways. And I actually think it's quite interesting. And I do think that we're in a phase now where there's a lot of ethical discussions going on in rock climbing. There's a lot of, for example, discussions about route names and a lot of discussions about inclusivity and things like that. And I think these are good discussions to be having. I don't always agree with the different positions that people take. On the name issue, I think that, I've been kind of monitoring the discussion, and I believe that there's bad arguments on both sides. There are those who, for example, say we should just leave it up to the person who developed the climb. It's up to them. If the first ascensionist, he gets to name it or she gets to name it. And I'm like, no, that doesn't follow. Just as a route developer needs to be responsible in terms of bolting and in terms of removing loose rocks, so too they need to be responsible in naming. And if they do something, they come up with a horrible name, and yes, we should change it definitely. But going the other way, there are people who say, well, if anybody at all is offended, if there's any person out there that's offended, it should be changed. And I'm like, no, that puts too much power in just one individual. It should be a community decision. So I think there are bad arguments on both sides. We're trying to do moral reasoning here. We're trying to do ethical reflection, and that requires actual reasoning. And sometimes I feel like, and at the risk of sounding like kind of an elitist snob, right now it seems like everybody on Facebook's a epidemiologist, and people are like, look, let's leave it to the experts. He's like, also right now everybody's an ethicist, and part of me wants to say, let's maybe leave some of these discussions up to some of the experts who actually are at least experienced in moral reasoning and thinking about moral reflection.
Oh yeah.
Is there something going on? Look, I believe I can't off the top of my head think of any particular form of dogmatism that is holding climbing back. I think actually people have become pretty open-minded, and they're sort of appreciative of different approaches to climbing. People going climbing, they're exploring different areas. I think the biggest challenge has to do with the sheer volume and number of people who are going climbing these days. And I think that's going to be what we really have to deal with in the future. We were talking about Red Rock implementing this reservation system, and that seems tough, and a lot of climbers have a problem with it. But the truth is, there is a problem out there with so many people. There really is an issue. And I think one of the things we need to be doing more of is educating people who learn to climb in the gym now. I mean, it used to be in my time, we learned to climb at the cliff, and we were mentored typically by people who had a lot of experience at the cliff. But now so many people are learning to climb in a climbing gym, and this isn't just in urban areas, it's in rural areas and suburbs too. And then they go outside, and they're not familiar with the ethos and the norms that are involved in climbing outside. One thing I've done for the SNCC is I put together a PowerPoint slide, and I think a lot of access organizations are doing this, where you're actually doing presentations at gyms and trying to explain to people, look, this is what you need to know when you go outside. Here are the ways in which it's not like a gym. Here's the way in which you should try to be considerate and courteous to other people. Here are the things you need to focus upon for safety, and just, go through those sorts of considerations. So for the people who really don't have the same kind of educational experience in learning how to climb that many of us did back in the 70s or 80s. So I think that needs to be happening a lot more. And I think it's just going to be a challenge dealing with the sheer number of people who are getting into climbing now. I think there's a tension here. On the one hand, I believe it's a good thing that there's a push towards inclusivity. And, certainly I think anybody who goes rock climbing should feel welcome regardless of their background or their ethnicity. And of course, that's exactly true. But at the same time, insofar as we're encouraging so many people to get into climbing, it's going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with regard to how we manage the crowds at the cliff. And that's something that I think is going to be a real challenge in the future.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for that. It kind of seems like the move that you guys made in Oregon towards what is now contemporary sport climbing was a bit of necessity. And there might have been attached to that this kind of will show you attitude, how we do it. And the defensive manufacturing holds, it was more of a rigorous line of reasoning.
Yeah, and pushing from that, we've had several conversations about climate change on this show. Mm-hmm. And where we always get stumped is how to move people to care enough to take action, or at the very least to try and avoid complacency. So our question is, do you have any general advice on how to motivate people to embrace changing their dispositions on climate?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The only thing I can kind of think of is that, first off, we need to take it seriously. It's real. There's no doubt about it. Anybody with the functioning cortex knows that this is a real thing. And so I'm very intolerant of people who just think it's a hoax or it's unreal. But I also think that there are going to be things we do that are going to contribute to it that are almost unavoidable. Like, for example, if I want to fly someplace on a climbing trip, that plane is going to contribute to carbon emissions and things like that. So one thing that I've heard of that I actually feel is something that we can encourage on people is that every time you do something like that, try to do something that offsets it, right? Contribute to planting trees or something along those lines in an effort to offset the various ways in which we contribute to climate change. Become politically active. A lot of this is going to have to come from the top down. And so it's really going to depend upon who we elect as our political leaders and whether or not they're going to take this seriously and start implementing things that I think will actually, in the long run, mitigate things. I think we're in trouble. We're headed towards a really bad situation. But it doesn't have to be completely horrific. We can do things now that will mitigate the kind of damage that is forthcoming. And so we need to be electing political leaders who take that stuff seriously. And, people recycle. Yeah, that's great. But there's other things we can be doing as well. And, if you can go someplace by biking and instead of driving, that's, I think, a good thing. And just look into it, do a little bit of research and try to figure out the ways in which you can offset your carbon footprint. All we can do is encourage people to do that. I actually believe that climbers are a pretty environmentally positive group. I think that climbers are more understanding and well-informed on these issues. And really most outdoor enthusiasts, for that matter, tend to be more environmentally aware than people who sit on the couch and watch football all day. I think that the problem is going to be maybe getting people in the climbing community to talk to those other people and encourage those other people to take the climate change seriously. But it's going to take everybody. It's going to take everybody getting on board. And recognizing this is a problem. And one thing I often say, to the maybe the older fuddy-duddies is, especially if they have kids, is think about your kids, right? Think about your obligation to them. You're always going on about how we can't be leaving them a terrible debt. Well, right now we're engaging in behavior that's going to be leaving them a terrible climate debt. And, we're leaving them a world quite possibly where it's going to be very hard to inhabit certain part of the world. And there's going to be all sorts of terrible things happening, as is happening now with the fires and with the hurricanes. We know that that's related to climate change. Sure, there's other contributing causes, but it's also connected to climate change. So, get people to start thinking about the poor young people who are going to be inheriting this planet. I don't have kids, but I deal with a lot of young people, and I feel badly for them. I feel that we need to be doing more to take into account what their future is going to be like. And I do find that resonates with people who may not be thinking along these lines most of the time.
I think it's also a matter of experience and experiencing these different changes, because you have people that probably think, oh, it's hot right now, but December's coming, it's going to be cold. And that mitigates that, oh, then climate change is not real because we're still getting this cold in December, etc. So it's just a matter of being exposed and actually experiencing these different changes and seeing how the patterns and everything comes together. And sometimes that's kind of hard because people are stubborn and sometimes they don't want to.
Yeah, I agree.
Outside.
Well, I think Al Gore is right. It's like the frog in the boiling water. If given that the changes we're seeing are gradual, people don't take it as seriously, or they think, oh, we can deal with that down the road. We still got 10 years, we got 15 years. And no, we need to start dealing with it now. I do believe, though, that the experiences that people, let's say now in California are having, or my family's from Oregon, the experience they're having, where they literally cannot go outside because of the air, because of the smoke, because of the fires. That's the future. That's what we're looking at. Or the people in the Southeast who are experiencing these increasingly savage hurricanes. Well, that's how things are going to be. Or the flooding taking place on coastal areas. Yeah, that's real. That's happening right now, and you're seeing how that happens. And I think those people are starting to get it because they are starting to have those kinds of experiences that are directly related to climate change. And so, yeah, I think you're right, though. People think, well, winter's coming, it won't be quite so bad. And it takes a lot of work to get people to get on board with this. I am optimistic about the younger generation. The younger people I'm talking to, they're taking it seriously. They know it's coming. Thank God for Greta. I think she's an amazing young woman. I think she resonates with a lot of young people. And a lot of times, I hate to say this, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's factually true. A lot of times when social progress occurs, or when we change for the better, it's less about changing minds And quite frankly, it's more about people with the wrong attitude dying off. And I think that's quite often how we get to a better place. But I am very optimistic about the younger generation and how much they take this seriously.
It's good that at least one of us is optimistic.
Yeah, that's right.
The other day I had a mental breakdown and I was like, oh my God, if 2020 is any indicative of what's coming, brace yourself.
Oh my God.
Yes.
No, 2020 is taking the cake. It's like the year from hell, basically. My sister, I was Zooming with her and she already had her Halloween decorations up. I said, geez, you've got your Halloween decorations up already? And I thought, well, maybe that makes sense because basically in 2020, every day is Halloween for the most part. It's
Essentially, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
Well, there's people that really like Halloween, so.
Yeah.
So one more serious question before we ask more lighthearted ones. This is quick. Can you please break down the details of the pain box?
Okay, yes. All right. So I was training one summer, and I was sort of trying to think about the nature of my training. And I realized that so much of what people have been promoting these days is you can get better, you can get stronger without any effort at all. 5-minute abs, 5-minute workout. That's all you need. And or you just drink this shake and it'll make you super strong, and or just sit in this vibrating chair and you'll lose all your fat and it'll be wonderful. And it was all just total crap, right? And so what I realized was that what people are trying to do is get all the gain without any of the pain. And so it seemed to me a better approach would just be a kind of more stoic perspective, which is just accept you have this amount of pain in your life. You just need to accept that. The quantity of pain is not going to go away. So you just need to accept the pain that is there. But what you can do about the pain is you can do pain reallocation. You can convert one kind of pain into another kind of pain. And so what occurred to me, and this is very much sort of described my training, was that so much of the time, the pain of hard work and training is being used to convert or to diminish the pain, the emotional pain of failure, of not succeeding at your projects and things like that. So the vision that I had was a box and with a divider right down the middle. And it divides the two different kinds of pain that exist in your life. One is the pain of suffering, of hard work and dieting and training and all that good stuff, the physical pain there. And the other one is the more perhaps psychological pain of being frustrated because you're not achieving your goals, you're not achieving success. And I realized that these are inversely related to one another. And so the box, of course, is fixed. The amount of pain in your life is fixed. So don't try to think you can get gain without pain. But what you can do is you can move this divider in either direction. And if you want less of the psychological pain associated with failure and with sucking and frustration, you can indeed reduce that kind of pain. You can move that bar across so that the quantity on that side of the box gets smaller. But of course, given good old geometry, when you do that, then the other kind of quantity increases. And that means the way you push the bar over is by increasing the volume of the pain associated with hard work and training and all that kind of stuff. And so I just thought it was a great sort of visual graph or geometrical representation of the old adage, no pain, no gain. And so it's a way of sort of articulating that in a mathematical format that I thought was pretty fun. But I do think it's a good model, and it's helped me in my training, right? I mean, there are times when I'm, at the end of the long training day, and I'm still really pretty beat up, and I really just want to go have a beer or something like that. But I'm thinking, man, don't I really want to reduce just a little bit more that psychological pain, that emotional pain of sucking, of failing, of not achieving my goals? Yeah, okay, all right. Well, if I stay and I train for another half hour, I'll push that bar just a little more over in that direction. And hopefully reduce that kind of frustration. And so that's the idea behind the pain box, basically. And you can do the same thing with a happiness box, right? I mean, as Aristotle would say, now there's this deeper kind of gratification of life, daimonia. It's a satisfaction of a life well lived. It's flourishing. That's one kind of happiness. And then there's the other kind of happiness where you get from, binging Netflix while eating tons of popcorn and cheeseburgers or something like that, And so there's a different kinds of pleasure. And once again, there's an inverse relationship between the two. If you want more of the deeper, more gratifying kind of happiness in life, it's probably good to have less of the, being lazy and just kind of like, goofing off and engaging what are often called guilty pleasures. So there's a relationship there as well. And I'm happy to send you folks the little essay I wrote that tries to spell all this out.
Please do. We'd love to see it. I actually, I saw it. It was just a picture somewhere. As I was just trying to do a little background research, it's really stalking. Like as we were trying to stalk you.
That's fine.
But I saw a picture of it with no context, and I'm like, well, what is this? So that kind of pushed us to ask this question.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I put that together, and then I've seen it pop up on other like websites that are devoted to cycle training, like bike racing and things like that.
Wow.
It's been picked up in some other formats as well, because of course I think it does apply to all different aspects of life. I mean, I don't want to come across as like, look, there's all life is suffering and hard work, and you must grind it out. No. Of course, having fun is important in life, and I certainly have a lot of fun too. But it's just a little bit of a motivator for the most part, and insofar as people get something out of it, that's great.
No, I mean, I can see some obvious applications for students too. I mean, yeah, you don't like studying,
Sure.
You don't like reading like deep philosophical text sometimes, but if you don't do that, you're going to suffer with a poor grade or something. There's a lot of applications.
Exactly
I love it.
Yeah, and I have explained it to my students as well. I don't know. They're like, what is he talking about now? But I have tried to explain it as a motivator for studying. You're exactly right.
I love it. So this question's going to seem like it's kind of out in left field, but it's a segue to kind of what might be our final conversation for today. Can you describe what would make a good or ideal climbing partner?
Oh, good question. I feel blessed because many of the people I have climbed with and I do climb with now are really great climbing partners. But I have to admit, I'm kind of snotty about it. There are a lot of people who I might just meet on a trip and they're like, hey, you want to climb today? And I'm kind of like, let me watch you play. I mean, I'm kind of a sticker about that because I've seen a lot of problems. I've seen a lot of accidents because of people belaying poorly. So numero uno is you have to be a really attentive and awesome belayer. And, when I'm projecting something, I'm probably taking 4 or 5 pretty big falls a day. I think on jumbo height, I would take falls that are about 30 feet long, 20 feet long, or something like that, because you're up there so high. And it really depends on how you're caught. And I think that most people don't understand. When I watch people, even professional climbers belay, they don't fully appreciate just how attentive you really should be. Like, for example, when someone clips a bolt over their head and then they climb up and pass, you'll get an increased amount of slack in the rope. And a lot of climbers just kind of let that sit there, like, okay, I'm kind of in a little vacation mode now. I'm checking out other climbers or something. I'm like, no, you should be taking in that slack and paying it out. You should be super attentive. I like to use the analogy of fly fishing. When I'm fly fishing, I'm constantly mending the line and adjusting it in various ways and paying it in and paying it out, flipping it around in various ways. And that's what I think you should be doing when you're belaying. And if I know that somebody's approaching a crux where they're likely to fall, I'll get in a crouched position so that I can time the jump properly to make the fall soft. A lot of people think that if you just leave out slack, that softens the fall, but quite often it doesn't. So, you really need to, I think there's such a thing as 514 belaying. I mean, really, really high level, high skill belaying. And I think it takes a lot of practice, and doing something like just timing your jump properly is really a skill level that people need to work on. A lot of times I'll see people belaying with flip-flops on. I'm like, no, you should have on, good shoes so that when you jump, you're slamming to the wall, you're not going to break your toe or something. So, I mean, belaying is numero uno, but I enjoy climbers with a sense of humor, who I can joke with in various ways. I like climbers who appreciate the process. I don't like climbing with people who are constantly throwing wobblers or who are constantly complaining about the conditions. I like people who are positive. I like people who, like I said, are really enjoying the experience. I like people who can engage in intellectual conversations. So much of the time on the road or whatever, you have downtime. I don't always want to be talking about climbing. I don't always want to be talking about, that move or something. I want to be talking about other things. And so I like people who are intellectually engaged. And that, to me, is what makes an ideal climbing partner. And thankfully, here in Las Vegas, there are a ton of people like that.
Towards the end of our interviews, we always do a fun section, lighthearted section. So with that answer that you just gave us, we're going to give you a list or a set of different philosophers, and you have to rate them on how good of a climbing partner they would be in their prime.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Okay, so let's start with Robert Audi.
Oh, Bob Audi. He is a great individual. I've learned a great deal from him. He was a former colleague of mine at Notre Dame. And it would be awesome because we would have probably a conversation about the epistemology of how much I understand a route. And so he specializes in, among other things, epistemology, but he's also done really important work in political philosophy as well. And so he would probably be asking, are you really justified in thinking
That's so great.
Get the rest back there? Like, how exactly are you justified in thinking that? Are you sure you really know that, right? I mean, what is your justification for that view? So it'd be super fun having those kinds of conversations with Bob.
So our next is actually a team. What do you think of climbing with Paul and Patricia Churchland?
Oh, that would be good fun. Again, one thing that I know that would happen if I climb with them is I'd have to wear a helmet because they'd be obsessing about my brain and what status my brain is in. They'd be deeply concerned about my brain. For those of you who don't know, Paul and Pat Churchland are philosophers of neuroscience. And in fact, when I was a grad student, Paul was on my committee and Pat was one of my professors, and she had just published a book called Neurophilosophy. And I remember when we were going through the book, I'm like, oh my God, is she really going to call it that? But it actually has proven to be an actual name of a field now, neurophilosophy. People I see applying for jobs call themselves neurophilosophy. And so they would both be, again, first off, asking me to make sure my brain's in good shape. And then they wouldn't be talking so much about how I feel about the climb or whether or not I was disappointed. They'd be talking about my neuroreceptors and whether my dopamine levels are at the proper level for trying this particular climb, and maybe my serotonin would need to be adjusted a little bit more.
That's so great.
And those sorts of things. So that's what it would be like to climb with them.
Okay, next one, Socrates.
Oh boy, Socrates. Well, Socrates would show up at the cliff, and he'd first off say, I don't really know this stuff about climbing. Could one of you people help define climbing for me? And then some poor kid would walk up and say, well, here's what climbing is. And she's like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. But here's the problem with that particular understanding. Here's what I don't get. Maybe you can help me with this. Maybe you can help explain this aspect, this idea of going up, but it seems like you guys are always coming down. So what's that all about, And so then somebody else would weigh in and say, gee, Socrates, okay, yeah, you got a good point there. Well, what about if we define it this way? And so I says, oh, yes, that's a very good definition. But now you're claiming that you're pulling up on things. I'm not so sure. And then, of course, eventually what would happen is somebody would just say, look, Socrates, let's just have a beer, okay? Let's just stop corrupting the youth, and let's just have a beer. And Socrates would say, okay, but I think I prefer wine.
Exactly. I'm going to throw these next two together, but you can break them down any way you want. So we have Descartes and Wittgenstein.
Oh, boy. Well, Descartes would come up and he would basically come up to the cliff and he'd say, now, are you really sure this is here? Because it seems to me there could be a deceiving demon who would convince us that, in fact, there is a cliff here and you are going to go rock climbing, but, maybe it's just all being heavily deceived. And again, there would be this Audi type question. Well, what justifies your belief? And how do you actually know that you're here at the climbing cliff, right? And I think we get to a point where he would just say, you know what? The only thing you really know is that you exist. And so, yeah, you're thinking, you're having these experiences. And so you can be certain that you do, in fact, exist. But really, you don't really know much other than that. So that's what I think would be like to climb with Descartes. Be a little bit frustrating, I think, at times. But in any event, it would still be interesting. Wittgenstein is so all over the place, and there's just so many different. Like everybody loves Wittgenstein, even though when they have opposing views, because they can always find passages in Wittgenstein that support whatever it is they're trying to say. The one area where I suspect I have a greater appreciation for Wittgenstein is with regard to his idea that we don't actually have clear definitions of things in our mind. And his analogy for this is a game. He says, look, try to come up with a definition for game. You'll never be able to come up with a nice, clean, tidy definition that captures everything. And I think what he would say is, case 10 points, climbing. Is climbing a game? And if it is a game, then how is it similar to playing poker or playing basketball? It seems like they're very different. Some involve competition, but climbing doesn't seem to involve competition. And I think he would use climbing as a way to illustrate the point that he's trying to make, that for most of our concepts, we can't come up with these nice, tidy, clean, clear definitions for things. And I think that's a good insight. I think that's actually correct.
David Chalmers, Australian.
Yes, actually, Dave's a good friend of mine. And we've had some great philosophical conversations. And Dave would, unlike the Churchlands, be at the cliff and suggest that, well, you don't really have to worry well, maybe you need to worry about your brain, but you got to realize, Bill, that this conscious experience you're about to have that you describe as sublime, that's not actually taking place in your brain. That's actually taking place in the non-physical realm, because David Chalmers is famous for having reintroduced dualism. Dualism is a view that your mind is separate from the brain. It's something like in the soul. Now, David doesn't believe in the soul, but he does believe that our conscious experiences are generated by the brain, but they're separate and distinct from the brain, and they don't actually exist in the physical realm. And so when you would ask him about what's it like to have that climbing experience, he would agree with another philosopher named Frank Jackson, say, well, you can tell me everything you want to know about what's happening in the brain, and you'll never capture what its likeness, that sheer qualitative phenomenal experience that you're enjoying joy from having clipped the anchors, or you are frustrated and angry because you failed to clip the anchors. And another point David would make is, well, really, Bill, I'm not 100% sure you're not a zombie, right? So in philosophy, zombies are people who are physiologically identical to the rest of us. They have the same brain, they have the same neurons, but it seems like it could be possible for someone like that to exist who doesn't have any consciousness, who's all their behavior is being driven by their nervous system. It's being driven by what's happening in their brain, but that conscious experience, that distinct and separate conscious experience, that doesn't exist. And so for Dave, he knows he's conscious. By simply looking at me as a physical being, he wouldn't be 100% sure that I'm conscious, that I'm having conscious experience. And so he might be a little concerned that he'd be being belayed by a zombie when he's trying to do a hard move.
I don't know why I have a feeling that you've had this conversation.
Yeah, we've had lots of good conversations, and he's actually a really, really great philosopher. He's become a really good public intellectual, and he always has really interesting insights, and he just loves to think about these things, and he's a really great guy in that regard.
So the last one, Diogenes.
Oh, I don't really know much about Diogenes. I, again, like a lot of the ancients, think that it would be hard for them to make sense of this crazy activity we're doing called climbing. And you know, it would be like, are we really moving through time and space in the way that you actually think when you're going up? I don't know about that. You know, we better stop and think about that. If you're actually going to get to the chains, have you really gotten to the chains? So I think it would all be a big mystery to him.
Those answers were great. It makes me want to try to gather as many of these people as possible and head out to Red Rocks, scoop you up in a van, and
yeah, I was thinking
we probably wouldn't get much climbing in, but it would be interesting
just for the heck of it to see how it goes, how it turns out.
Yeah.
So as far as question goes, that's it. We usually like to offer the last couple of minutes to you if there's anything else that you want to talk about, or if there's anything you want to plug outside of UNLV's philosophy, I would say climbing accepting philosophy department.
I mean, one thing I would say for everybody, getting back to what we were talking about earlier about how I think we're all going to need to be doing work to preserve climbing, is to get involved with your local climbing organization. You know, a few years back, I kind of realized how much climbing has given me and how much it's done for me. And I realized I really have an obligation to give something back. So I got involved with the Southern Nevada Climbers Coalition. I became president for a while. Now I'm vice president. We have a really good organization, and we've got, you know, professional climbers involved like Jonathan Segrist. It's just really. I know you had Irene Yee on earlier, and she is really a great person who helped us out in various ways. And so I would just encourage everybody to, if you love climbing, try to give something back by getting involved with your local access group. When they have weekend litter pickups, or they're doing trail work or graffiti removal, you know, it really is worth it to spend a morning or spend an afternoon or at least a day doing something to try to give something back. And so I would just encourage everybody in the country to give to those organizations, become members of the Access Fund, and do what you can to give something back, because we really do need to work hard to preserve the wonderful outdoor areas that we're recreating in. And we want to be good stewards. And I think climbers generally have a pretty good reputation for the way they treat the outdoors. I know that most land managers like working with climbers. Like I said, we have a close relationship with BLM. And so, yeah, just try to give something back, and just know that we're going to have lots of challenges in the future, in particular with the sheer volume and sheer number of people who are getting into climbing. And I would encourage gym owners to try to implement programs where we're doing a little bit more to teach people how to go from the gym to the outdoors. So that's what I would just encourage everybody to do, is get involved with the Access Fund and get involved with your local access organization, and become a member and donate to them. And donate some of your time as well. That'd be the main thing.
That's awesome, Bill. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll make sure to keep spreading the word.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. This has been really fun. You guys asked really interesting questions, and it's really been fun thinking about the answers. So I've really, really enjoyed this. Keep up the good work.